Do you feel like your paintings are lacking in depth and they feel flat and you really can't put the finger on why that is? Well, if you recognize yourself in this description, then this video might be helpful. My name is koivumaa. I'm a Swedish watercolor artist, and in this video I'm going to go through some of the basics that are quite important to know if you want to have some depth in your paintings. So let's get started. So let's start with the perspective. That's probably the most basic thing that you need to know about if you want to create depth in your paintings. I know that perspective, the word, can be quite intimidating for some people, but if you're doing landscapes, you can simplify it quite a lot. For example, everything that is further away from you has the tendency to look smaller. So look at this path, for example, in this landscape here. You can see that it's quite wide at the bottom. In the foreground, it's so wide that it even goes out of the picture. And as the path is going further away from us, closer to the horizon line, the part where land meets sky, then it is quite small. It gets smaller and smaller further away. And the same thing goes for any other elements in your painting. Let's look at some of these trees, for example. The trees that are closer to us, they appear a lot bigger, they're wider, they're taller, they go out of the picture as well, those that are in the foreground. And those trees that are further back are a lot smaller, they're skinnier, and they're not as tall. And the same thing goes for the rock. You can see the big rock to the left, that one is the closest to us, and then you have rocks that are similar size, but they're further back into the painting, and those appear a lot smaller. So all of this is pretty basic, right? But what happens if you have a big rock that's further back into the painting and a small rock in the foreground? Well, here you have two options as I see it. Either you paint exactly what you see, but the risk is that the perspective is going to look a little bit off. It's going to look weird with that big rock further back and the small rock in the foreground. So what I would do is probably change it around a little bit. I would alter it. I would make sure that the rock in the back looks a lot smaller and the rock in the foreground looks a lot bigger. So sometimes it's not only about painting exactly what you see to capture the right perspective. Sometimes it's about helping the eye to understand the depth in the painting. So the basic rule pretty much is things that are closer to you are bigger and things that are further away appear a lot smaller. So perspective is crucial if you want to create a sense of depth in your paintings. Another thing that is also important is placement of elements. And this means that if you have different elements or things or whatever you want to call them in your painting and you put them in front of each other, then you're naturally going to get a sense of depth in your painting. So look at this painting that I did on the left here. In the foreground you have this girl walking towards us, and behind her there is a lady that's crossing the street. And just those two together is creating a depth in the painting. The girl is in front of the old lady and the lady is behind her. And all the way in the back you have the building, so that's yet another level of depth into the painting. And let's look at a different example of this. This is a painting of Stockholm I did a while back, and it has buildings, it has cars, and they're quite far back. And the painting is not done here. I decided to add a person, I decided to add a little kid, a little child in the foreground, and look at the difference here when I added the child into the painting. All of a sudden there is a new level of depth into the painting where the child is in the foreground and all the other elements are pushed back a little bit. So in other words, if your painting is lacking depth, then maybe it's just missing something in the foreground. Okay, let's look at the next thing that we can think about when it comes to depth, and that is contrast. And contrast can mean a lot of different things. So I'm going to go through a few of those contrasts that's actually going to help out with the sense of depth in your painting. And the first contrast is the contrast between soft and sharp. Things that are really far away tend to look a lot softer, and things that are closer to us are a lot sharper. So if you look at this painting to the right here, you can see the buildings, you can see some of the hay or grass in the foreground, some rocks and so on, and all of those are quite sharp in comparison to the mountains that's all the way in the back. So by using this technique, you're definitely going to get another level of depth in your paintings. Another contrast that is quite important is temperature. So if you look at this painting to the right once again, you can see that the temperature on the buildings and everything in the foreground is quite warm in comparison to the mountain in the back that's almost blue, so it's quite cold. So elements that are quite far away, like mountains for example, in a landscape, they tend to look a lot cooler, and this is something that you can apply in other landscapes as well. You make sure that the hue that you're adding is a little bit cooler to the elements that are further back in comparison to the ones that are closer to us. That will also enhance the sense of depth in your paintings. Another kind of contrast that could enhance the sense of depth in your painting is intensity. So if we look at this landscape here to the right, we have the tents painted in high intensity, red, yellow, orange, and so on. And the mountain in the back is quite gray, so it has low intensity. And the difference between these two creates an interesting contrast that also enhances the depth in the painting. So these are a few things that could affect the sense of depth in your paintings. And let's summarize what I brought up in this video. So the first thing that I brought up was perspective. That is quite important. Another thing was placement of elements, having things in front of each other. And the last thing that I talked about was contrasts of different kinds. So take another look at that painting of yours that you feel that is flat and something is missing. Maybe one of these things might be helpful in that painting. And if you want to practice doing paintings with depth in them, then you're more than welcome to visit me on my community on Patreon, because I release a new tutorial every week, painting watercolors, mostly landscapes with a lot of depth in them. And I've been doing that for quite some time now, so there is plenty of tutorials on the site already as it is. This is what it could look like, for example. Perhaps I should do a little bit more work here next to the building. I talked about it before, that there's buildings over there, and maybe I should just do a few brush strokes